So going back to the slide, nourishing spiritual and emotional intimacy, the next question is, are you truly invested in the wellness of your loved one? And I shared this story in my Mormon Stories interview, but I'll share it here again. So a little over a year ago at the Affirmation Conference, this is the King Solomon analogy. Affirmation is an LGBTQ related affirming type of organization, and it was held directly before the Sunstone Conference last year. And at the end of a question and answer session, there was what we might call a active believing Mormon or true believing Mormon woman that came up and through tears asked a question. And she said, I just don't know what to do. I'm experiencing a tremendous amount of pain and fear of loss because my daughter is lesbian, and it's extremely painful for her to go to seminary and to go to church. And she tells me if she goes, like, it'll kill her. But I'm afraid of her losing God, and I'm afraid of what this means if she doesn't come, and I need her to come. I need her to be part of the church. I need her to not lose God. And Derek Knox shared this analogy. He's a theologian, a gay man who joined the church not too many years ago, actually, as an openly gay man, not in a relationship at the time. I don't think currently. Anyway, he shared this story. He said, in the book of Kings, and I'll do injustice to it, but I'll do my best. In the book of Kings, there's this story of these two women, and they each have a child. And one of the infants dies, and the two women argue between each other over whose child the surviving infant is. And they're arguing over it, and they go before King Solomon, and King Solomon listens to their arguments and thinks about it. And in the story, what King Solomon does is he requests his servants to bring him the cutting device, whatever it would be, a sword or something like that. And he said, this is the solution. We'll cut the baby in half, and each of you can take half of the baby. And one of the women who seemed to be more concerned about winning or something like that said, okay, I'm fine with that solution. And the other woman, and we tend to believe that it was the actual mother, but it's not really clear in the story. It could have not been the mother, because sometimes our family members can be more concerned about winning than what this story is representing. The one woman said, no, I would rather that this child live. So give the child to the other woman so that the child could live. And so Derek explained, this story that sometimes we're faced with this decision that our loved ones could grow up in a different home than ours and live. And he asked this woman, do you love your gay daughter enough for her to grow up in a different spiritual home as yours and live, versus needing her to be in your spiritual home, and it could harm her and even kill her emotionally, spiritually, culturally, and maybe even physically? Do you love your daughter enough that she could grow up in a different spiritual home? And the woman, through tears, said, absolutely, I can. And so this was a very helpful story and analogy that Derek shared. And it was helpful for people that were in the audience. And one of my friends who was in the audience is an active member of the church, nuance believing, married to someone that doesn't have the same degree of Orthodox belief. And it was really important to him that she sit with him in church, and that she be part of the spiritual home of the family. But what this story did for him is it helped him reconcile or recognize that his wife might thrive and grow more in a spiritual home that's different than his, and that he could actually see that and hold space for her in that, and trust that if she's dying sitting next to him in church, if she can sit next to him in church, that's great. But if she's dying sitting next to him in church, and that she would thrive elsewhere, that he can hold space for her in that. And we used this story and shared it, that it's not only applicable to express to the more Orthodox believing member that you need to hold space for for the less or non-Orthodox person, that they could thrive in a different home than your spiritual home. But it's also helpful for those of us who have lost literal belief that if our spouse thrives in the church, and we see that, and they're not harming other people and they're not harming themselves to a degree that would necessitate intervention, we should be able to hold space for them and support them in that they can grow and thrive in the place that they're planted currently. So the next question on the slide is then, how can I support you in spiritually and individually thriving? And then there's the cross story. And I shared this in my Mormon Stories interview, but I'm going to share it again here. To understand that part of processing grief and part of nourishing spiritual and emotional intimacy that helps us grow through grief in a healthy way is to understand the impact of symbols in our lives. So in our local Mormon Spectrum group, it's a support group that I created and co-lead in Billings, Montana. There's a member of our group who grew up in the church, and she married a non-member. And throughout her life, her greatest desire, and she would plead to God, and she would go to the temple and fast and pray for God to soften her husband's heart so that he could join the church, so they could be a together family. She had a tremendous amount of investment and desire to God for this, and it didn't happen. And then she went through a faith crisis, and she lost belief. And she has multiple children, and one of the daughters is still a believer in the church, went on a mission, came home from a mission, and was going to get married in the Billings, Montana temple the first Saturday of May. And what this dear sister in our group asked our Mormon Spectrum support group to do is she asked if we would go on a Friday afternoon and go to the temple and walk around the temple grounds and sit where she was going to sit during the temple ceiling, to which she and her husband and two of her children would be excluded, and process what she was going to feel and experience, so that day that she could do better support her daughter in that experience. And so several of us showed up, six of us or so showed up on a Friday afternoon, and we went to the Billings, Montana temple, and it was the first time this dear sister had been back on the temple grounds since her faith crisis. And we walked around, and we talked, and we cried, and we hugged each other. But there was something that came out of that conversation, out of the curiosity that happens in these support groups. And I don't know how exactly we got to this discussion, but somewhere in the discussion we started talking about symbols. And I shared that my perception that as human beings we have symbols that mean a lot to us of devotion to the divine. The flag is a symbol, or my wedding band is a symbol. For active believing members of the church, their garments are a symbol. We have different symbols. And for evangelical Christians, at least the ones with whom I've spoken, the symbol of an empty cross is a deeply meaningful symbol, because Jesus isn't on the cross anymore. So it's a symbol that Christ has risen, that there's hope, that there's atonement, that there's resurrection. It's the symbol of an empty cross is a deeply meaningful symbol for evangelical Christians. It's a symbol of the love of God. It's a very deeply meaningful symbol. And for my friends who are Catholic, the symbol of the cross with Jesus on the cross, suffering on it, is a deeply meaningful symbol for them, at least the ones with whom I've spoken, because it's the symbol that the very creator of the universe, God, would take on the form of man in Jesus and suffer and die for us on the cross. So it's this deeply meaningful symbol of love, of the love of God, of a sense of connection to the divine and significance. And although in Mormon history, the cross was a significant part of our history until the early 1900s, since the 1900s, the symbol of the cross in cultural Mormonism has been the cross is a murder weapon. So it's a symbol of apostasy, of victory for Satan, of how Jesus was killed. It's a symbol used by churches that the narrative was that the churches were born out of the apostasy. It's a very negative symbol. And so So it's the same symbol, but there's different meanings. And so what I asked this dear sister as part of this conversation, I asked her, if you were to imagine back when you were a true believing active member of the church, if your daughter had gone through a faith transition and become an evangelical Christian, and the most meaningful symbol to her of devotion to the divine and connection with God that you could give her would have been maybe a bracelet with an empty cross on it, could you had the capacity to buy that cross or that bracelet with an empty cross on it for your daughter if that was her most meaningful symbol of devotion to the divine? And my friend, this dear sister, thought about it for a little bit, and she says, you know what? I could do that. I could give her a bracelet with a cross on it. And I pointed at the windows on the temple building, and 2 rooms away from where we were standing was the sealing room where her daughter would be sealed to her exclusion, to the exclusion of this dear sister and her husband, very painfully. And I said, that's your daughter's cross. That's all it is. It's just a symbol of devotion to the divine. So if you could have held space for your daughter and bought her a bracelet with an empty cross on it, can you hold space for this cross, for her symbol of devotion to the divine? And she thought about it, and she says, yes, I can. I can do that. And she said, you know what else I can do? She says, I like this idea of the bracelets. And so what she ended up doing is she ended up getting bracelets for the girls and tie tacks for the men with symbols on it that represented their family. And what she did is she ended up giving that bracelet to her daughter and told her that when you're in the temple that day, kneeling across the altar, holding your husband's hand in that sealing ordinance, in that very moment, I want you to look down at the bracelet with these symbols on it and know that that's us there with you in that very moment. And it was a very deeply meaningful discussion for the members of our group that were there in that experience. It was very deeply meaningful for all of our group. And since that time, I've shared the cross story multiple times. In an interview with Gina Colvin, I shared the cross story, and the most significant feedback that I received from people with regard to that interview had to do with the helpfulness of the cross story. And so as we're going through these things, we need to recognize that the meanings for our symbols evolve and they change, and it can be very painful as they change, but we need to recognize that they're just symbols and recognize that they can change. So a couple other things on this slide would be to visit with your loved ones about how to let them know how you can support me spiritually and individually as I seek to thrive post belief, and then to get curious about how we can support other people. And then we need to have times, the next bullet point is we need to have times with our loved ones as we're processing these things to have connection without tension. So we need to have date nights that are free from hard conversations. And we need to have different times where the discussion isn't dominated with processing grief and things like that. All right. So
just as a time check, I think we can go another 30 to 45 minutes, but you've got a lot of slides, so balance all that because there's a lot of good content here.
I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you. So the next slide is a quote from Brené Brown, and the slide is a Brené Brown quote about spirituality, and I'll read it for the listeners. Spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. Practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives. And for my atheist friends, you call it elevation, emotion, and dopamine. You know, whatever it is that you want to call it. It could be spirituality, it could be the divine, it could be dopamine, whatever it is. We do, as human beings, sense a spiritual connection with each other. In the next slide is a quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And the quote in the meme is, the best thing one can do when it's raining is to let it rain. A lot of times when we're processing grief, we're trying to stop the grieving process from happening. We're trying to stop things from happening. And sometimes we just need to recognize that we just need to sit with it and be okay that it's raining and there's nothing we can do about it. So let's just let it rain. And then let's observe what's happening and then make decisions going forward.
And I love both of those quotes. You know, so many ex-Mormons, post-Mormons become so allergic to this idea of anything that was related to Mormonism. And so the word spirituality can be very triggering.
Yeah.
And they also can associate spirituality with some sort of metaphysical worldview, that there's, you know, spirits or some type of theology or something outside of the perceived physical experience. And spirituality can just literally mean connection to something higher, be it community, be it nature. It doesn't have to involve actual spirits or a belief in God or an afterlife.
It can be a dopamine released in your system when you're petting your dog or you're spending time with people. Whatever it is, whatever meaning you want to attribute to that experience, those experiences do happen.
And we need, but more importantly, we need that.
We need those.
And so if we think we don't need spirituality, once we, you know, after we encounter a faith crisis, or even once we've lost our belief in God and Jesus, I think we're neglecting one of the primary holes that that opens up in us when we have a faith crisis.
Yeah.
And then the other one about just sitting with pain, you know, we're not used to that idea. We're used to self-medicating in whatever way we can, whether it's drugs and alcohol, whether it's avoidance, whether it's Netflix, whether it's serving a lot in a calling, anything we can do to avoid actually experiencing or feeling what we're feeling. And that's one of the things I love about secular Buddhism or mindfulness or, you know, Eckhart Tolle, is this practice of just sitting with and being with our pain and suffering, leaning into the sadness or the anger or the grief. We're going to work through it when we do, but we have to first realize that sitting with something as awful as it feels is the first step to growing beyond it, and avoiding the feeling, avoiding the sadness, avoiding the anger, suppressing it, packing it down, spending eternity on Reddit without ever really processing anything.
Right.
You can just get stuck in the sadness or the anger and never really grow.
And rewound yourself and it's not healthy growing through grief. I mean, we need to vent and process things, but we need to not get stuck.
Yeah.
And this goes back, and I'm glad that you brought this up, because it is a Buddhist discussion or thought, and Eckhart Tolle has popularized it, you know, in A New Earth and others, is that our inner being, our consciousness is what our identity is. Our identity isn't form. It's not roles or responsibilities or experiences or the labels that we put on ourselves. That's not our identity. Those are simply our experiences, and our identity is our being. And one part that I think has been helpful for a lot of people, at least in the discussion at the Thrive Conference, and it was helpful for me, is to recognize that when we're experiencing a grieving process, this is an experience that we're having. It's not our identity. So Eckhart Tolle would say, when you're experiencing anger, it's more helpful to recognize it as that there's anger within me, or that I'm experiencing anger, that not I'm angry. It's not my identity.
Right. That's huge.
So I'm experiencing anger. There's anger within me. Why am I experiencing this? What can I learn from this? You know, to sit for a moment with mindfulness techniques, or focus on your breathing, or whatever the case might be, and sense, okay, I'm experiencing some anxiety. I'm experiencing a tightness in my chest. I'm experiencing anger, depression. And then to sit with that, and then ponder and get curious about, why am I experiencing these things right now? What can I learn from this, and so forth? So the next slide is a slide from Richard Rohr, and the quote is, "The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better." And that just goes to a reinforcement of these other things that I've been talking about, is that part of processing grief is to find new things to grow beyond. Lindsay Hansen Park, when I was going through my faith crisis and she sat with me back in June of 2016, she expressed that anger and depression is part of the grieving process because it burns the ground to make place for new growth. So part of the grieving process is to plant new growth there, you know, so practice the good. I'm going to not spend any time on the 7 stages of grief. with the Kubler-Ross model. You've done an excellent job with that in your Gift of a Mormon Faith Crisis episode.
So we'll just refer people to that. If you go to Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis, me, Natasha, and Margie spent a few hours talking about the important, strategic, crucial role of grieving and anger and sadness in a faith crisis, and how so many ex-Mormons, post-Mormons are stereotyped as never being able to get beyond the anger and the grief, and then many just appear to be stuck in it. So it is important. So thank you for referring to that.
Yeah,
you can list them though, just for those who don't know.
So the 7 stages of grief are shock, which is initial paralysis, then denial, trying to avoid the inevitable, and then anger, which is a frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotion. And then we bargain, so we're trying to negotiate, seeking in vain for a way out of our grief. Then we experience depression, which is a final realization of the inevitable. We test, trying to figure out realistic solutions going forward. And then finally, acceptance, where we finally find a way forward into new growth. And these stages are not, like I mentioned, they're not linear. We get to revisit, we get to retraverse things, and we get to traverse the stages of grief about new things. So you might have traversed the stages of grief with regard to your lost constructs about God or belief and faith in the church, and then months later find a new thing to grieve. So, we need to get good at processing grief because we're all going to experience it. And
not just with the faith crisis, with the death of a loved one, with a divorce, with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
We need to learn how to grieve.
Yeah.
And this is another thing. You can go through 50 years of Mormon curriculum, Sunday school, priesthood, Relief Society, Seminary Institute, and never once do they talk about grief and the stages of grief. And,
right.
Yeah.
It would be a fifth Sunday presentation or homemaking. Yeah, because it's not in the curriculum.
Anything. We need to become grief literate.
Yeah. And
like we need to become intimacy literate.
We need intimacy and grief literate.
Yeah.
Grief, when other people experience grief, it makes us uncomfortable. So, sometimes if we have a loved one who has someone that's died, we need to figure out how to support that person and mourn with them. Sometimes we do unhelpful things like, try to minimize their grief by saying, oh, God just must have needed them on the other side, or you're going to learn from this or whatever. We're trying to minimize their experience rather than just sitting with them and asking them about their experience. We need to get better at that. And there are some fantastic resources about learning how to mourn with people in terms of sitting with them, listening to their story, validating their experience, realizing that we don't have to agree with their experience to validate it and so forth.
We don't need to try and fix people's problems.
We don't need it. Yeah.
If somebody's suffering, you don't have to resolve the CES letter for them or tell them you're coming back to church. You can just say, this is hard. Let me sit with you in your suffering.
Yeah. Tell me about your experience. Yeah.
What's it like?
Yeah.
How does it feel?
And
I'm so sorry.
Trust it.
Yeah.
And then I shared in my Mormon Stories interview that when we're processing grief, our countenance changes. And from the outside, in the dominant narrative, it might be that is the buffetings of Satan, but it's not. It's just that we're processing grief. And so sometimes when we're processing grief, if we make unhealthy choices with regard to testing behavioral boundaries, and then we're angry and we're processing grief and our countenance has changed, that feeds into the narratives that are unhelpful, that the reason why we lost belief is we just wanted to sin, or that Satan has taken over us and so forth. So we'll finish up with going through some of the participant questions.
And just, I can go till about noon, so we do have 30 minutes left.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Then you get to speak too, because I won't use the whole 30 minutes.
Okay, that's fine.
So the first question that we had in our session was, how do we get not stuck in the denial or bargaining stages of grief? And the answer that I shared, at least my perspective, is that as human beings, there's a tremendous value in the dynamic of interpersonal human connection in the grieving process. And that's why there are actual camps called comfort camps that are for children who are grieving the loss of a parent or a loved one, where children can go to these nonprofit camps and spend several days with a bunch of other children that are in their exact same circumstance. So they're around people that understand what they've experienced, and they have grief counselors, and that experience of being together and having that shared in-person interaction, and whether you want to call it God or a dopamine release or whatever it is that you want to call it, part of the healing process and being able to not get stuck in different stages of grief is to have in-person support. And so in the session, I talked about that and how things like Alcoholics Anonymous, and others, these are different in-person groups and support groups that can help us not get stuck in the grieving process.
Really quick, since you invited me to jump in a bit.
Yes.
As we think about these stages as they apply to faith transitions, I often think about the denial or bargaining stages as our attempts to, and this is tricky because, we're raised as very literalist Mormons, Bibles, the earth is 6,000 years old and the global flood and, all the literalistic stuff, one true church, all that. Book of Mormon is the most correct book. Prophet speaks to God. I mean, all these things are highly problematic once you barely scratch the surface, but right. As long as we're Orthodox, they're all just absolutely true. So for me, I just think of denial or bargaining sometimes as that initial step into like, whoa, I didn't learn this stuff. It's problematic. Well, let me find a way, often through apologetics, to kind of like start softening the literalism enough to remain an Orthodox member, and to swat away all the critics' arguments like flies, but to still kind of maintain my orthodoxy. And now I do believe that apologetics can go into legitimate progressive Mormonism where you say, hey, yeah, very little to none of it's literal, but I find value in the participation. And that I don't necessarily think has to be bargaining. But I do view conventional Mormon apologetics as a form of bargaining in a faith transition. Do you?
Yeah, so I do. So one thing that I would say is
it's the horse is maybe when they said horse they meant taper kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Right. So I would kind of separate and parse it a little bit. If you find yourself stuck in a grieving process, then those reconciliations aren't going to be helpful because it's part of grief. If you're seeking those kinds of things not as part of a grieving process, then maybe you have a different experience with those things and those are helpful for you.
Yeah.
So, all right, the next question was, how do we deal with the inner apologist voice in our heads? How do we unpack the shame-based scripted narrative voice and set boundaries for ourselves? And part of that are resources like Eckhart Tolle and secular Buddhism, and part of that is meeting in support groups and processing things, so forth. The next question was,
but wait, so
go for it.
Basically, what they're asking is, and tell me if I'm missing this question. It's just we're conditioned that the church is true, that if we take off our garments, we'll cheat on our spouse, or a bullet won't ricochet against our garments, and to fear that we're scared that our kids are going to become, evil if we leave the church, or that our marriage will implode, or whatever it is. And so there's just always this voice in our head that's making us second guess where we are, and it's basically saying, how do you cope with that voice? Is it always going to be there? Does it weaken over time? And if so, how do you kind of make that annoying voice go away?
Yeah. It's a blame or a shame-based voice. It's your fault.
Or a fear voice.
It's a fear voice. Yeah, it's your fault.
You can't be happy.
You can't be happy. It's your fault. You need to fix this. You need to figure it out. If these apologists can figure it out, you should be able to figure it out. You're not dumb. There must be something in your life that's not right. That kind of voice.
Will that voice always be with us, or?
So that's why you want to read or listen to Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth, and then Oprah's Super Soul Conversation, chapter reviews of each of those, because Eckhart Tolle would tell you that that's your ego, that's not your being.
Yeah.
And recognizing that voice plays a role, but that's not who your identity is, and you need to recognize where that comes from, and it's conditioning, and it's something born out of protection, but it's not actually who you are.
And just to add my 2 cents, like if you understand neurology and how the brain works, it works through associations. And there's no way to unlearn something. In other words, there's no way to go back into your brain and remove the associations that have been made.
Right.
So in some sense, that voice will always be with you. The question is how strong and how bothersome versus how weak and sort of peripheral that voice becomes. And the secret to creating new associations is just new learning. So when you leave the church and you start raising good kids and you find out that they're awesome, or you start strengthening your marriage or finding joy or finding a new community or friends, don't wear your garments and realize that you don't get shot by a bullet and die. And, you're worried that you'll get financially destroyed, but then you get that promotion or that random check in the mail, even after you've left the church. You create those new associations over time, and your brain will strengthen positive associations with the transition. And while that nagging voice in the background may never totally go away, it'll fade more into the background, and it'll have less of a hold on you. So the trick isn't to make that voice go away. It's to create new associations so that voice becomes so weak, and new learning creates stronger voices, positively reinforcing you towards your growth. That's my answer.
Yeah, and Eckhart Tolle would say also, in addition to that, is just to be observant that that's a voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah, it's just a thought.
That's a thought.
It's just a
where
thought.
did that thought come from?
Yeah.
Why did I have that thought? What's the origin? Do I want to hold on to it or not?
And Noah Rasheta is our own post-Mormon version of Eckhart Tolle, and secular Buddhism focuses on this stuff as well. Really, Eckhart Tolle is just kind of New Age popularized secular Buddhism. True?
A lot of it. Yeah, it's very helpful. Yeah. All right. So we kind of answered how to be peace with acceptance already. So we'll skip that question and we'll go to the next question. And the next question is, how do we increase our capacity to let go of others' opinions of us and be comfortable with our own views and opinions? And the feedback that I got from this question answer was probably one of the strongest for the session. So how do I let go of other people's opinions of us? So Brene Brown talks about, I'm reading from the slide for the listener. Brene Brown talks about not telling our stories until our own well-being is not reliant upon the responses of others. The next bullet point is we need to understand boundaries and timing. It might be initially as limited as saying, I stumbled across the gospel topic essays and found some things I cannot reconcile, and my views about the church have changed. I'm the same person. I love you. It doesn't change how I feel about you. So maybe that's a boundary that we set, and that's how we deal with concern about other people's feelings about us. It's generally not helpful to come out fully when we're still in very, very deep grief, because it's hard to not have our well-being affected by others' response. The next thing we've talked about a little bit before is the next step is to invite others into activities that feed us spiritually as shared spiritual languages. So that's some of how we get more comfortable with other people's views and opinions about us, is we engage them productively and we claim our own parts of Mormonism that worked for us, whether it's service to others or time in nature or family time and so forth. And that can help alleviate their concerns and deal with that. And then the next one is to come to a place where we can claim our own spirituality privately and collectively, and then to understand that a significant source of pain in these matters is how we impute upon each other attributions to our respective symbols instead of just trusting differentiated types of experiences. So those are some of the things that can help us.
So let me see if I understand. It seems like you're basically saying, we're in response to the question, and this is huge. I call this the Nephi complex.
Yeah.
So many of us who leave the church over social justice issues or intellectual issues aren't leaving the church because we cared so little or wanted to drink beer or wanted to look at porn or cheat on our spouse. We're going through a faith crisis because we cared so much about the church teaching us the importance of truth or kindness or charity or Christ-like service or going after the one or whatever it is. And that leads us, those values that ironically we learn as Mormons, lead us to care about gay and lesbian people or women or people of color, or lead us to care about the church's truth claims, and then it becomes our undoing. But my point is that so many of us are used to being the Nephi. We're the righteous ones. We're the APs and the zone leaders on the mission. We're the former Relief Society presidents or bishopric members or stake high councilmen. And part of that sort of like model is we were the good ones. We were the good kids. We were the ones that the parents said, oh, they're the strong ones. They're the Nephi's. I wish we had an analog to Nephi within the Book of Mormon of like a really valiant woman, but we kind of don't.
Right.
But it's hard to get rid of that voice. That is one of the primary, if I'm guaranteed to see tears in a Mormon faith crisis retreat or workshop, it's when I talk about this idea of the Nephi complex and how used to being the righteous one by the father or the mother singling out their child as the righteous one, and then they're the ones that fall away. It's really hard, or just in the ward, like being perceived as the gospel doctrine teacher, the strong one, the bishop, the missionary, ward mission leader. Like so many of us were the real valiant ones, and our egos got used to the positive social reinforcements of being perceived and having the reputation as being valiant. And so it is a non-trivial thing to contemplate this idea of letting go of that voice in our head. And it really is ego. If you read Eckhart Tolle, it is
ego.
Attachment to form, which is suffering.
Our identity and our role.
But it's so hard to do. And it's guaranteed to evoke tears when we tell people, you need to learn to not care so much about what your dad or mom thinks of you.
Right.
It's non-trivial.
But to narrow it down then is to say, number one, recognize that if you're going through grief and having this experience, it can be unhelpful to really unpack this publicly if you're grieving. But number two, as you move and grow forward, and that's why I spent time on these spiritual values and so forth, the significant answer to that is to do good and practice better and invite others into that. So you can just be a different kind of Nephi, or Nephita, or if you're female, and go do, like I did. I explained my Mormon Stories interview that my wife and I created a GoFundMe, and we raised $28,000 to buy a replacement trailer home for a woman and her disabled daughter. That was good. That was a spiritual practice that my wife and I shared, and I was able to invite other people into that, so I could just be a different kind of Nephi.
Yeah. So, and just to kind of summarize what I'm hearing you say is, you're basically saying, don't come out till you're ready. Don't come out when it's going to cause you to lose your job, when you need the financial support, or when you need the familial or social support. Just wait to kind of start being vocal until you're in a safe place to do so. Yep. But then also live your values, live the goodness, live the light so strongly that it's almost confusing and disorienting to people. It's just like, how are you like even more amazing than you were and you left the church? I don't, does not compute. I do not understand.
So it's a play on Third Nephi where the next version of Nephi and Lehi, testified with such power and authority that the detractors could not disbelieve their words. Like it's, you go do good things so they can't disbelieve that there's light in you.
And and again, you can't be attached to their opinion of you, because they may. I like to say that a post-Mormon could win the Nobel Peace Prize, could discover the cure for cancer, and they're always going to be viewed as a disappointment by their parent.
Right.
You can't do good things attached to the hope that your parents will all of a sudden value your path and validate your path, because for many Orthodox believing Mormons, that's just never going to happen.
It can't be about being accepted. It needs to be about connecting and bringing other people in the experience.
And because it's your values.
It's because your value.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's fun, and you have a chance of softening hearts and minds, because if you're a post-Mormon that's angry and broken and dysfunctional, and we've all been there,
yep,
that's not going to be very appealing or attractive to anybody. And that's only going to reinforce people's desire to stay Orthodox, if they were inclined to anyway, just because like you're a mess and you're like becoming that cautionary tale and self-fulfilling prophecy of a life unraveling. And have compassion for yourself if you're there. But if you can get to a super healthy, happy, thriving place, that can speak way more volumes than the CES letter or some factoid about church history. People will see the light coming out of your eyes, and not all, but many will find that attractive and appealing and sometimes disorienting.
It can be, but don't beat yourself up over this.
Yeah.
Find community, realize that this is a process and we get to do it over and over again.
Totally.
So the next question is how to accept that we are going to be a disappointment for others and who will experience pain from our changed beliefs. So it's kind of a continuation of the current discussion. And then, so one of the answers that I gave is and I'll actually put it on the slide. When there's a question,
Because we hate to disappoint people, right?
yeah. So if there's a question that keeps you up at night, let's answer the question, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So in the financial crisis, I had clients, who were retired that came to me, and clients that own businesses that came to me, and they were concerned about thousands of banks failing, and what if the dollar fails, and what if we end up in a depression, and so there were all these questions that would keep them up at night. And so what I would say individually, and I even did group client meetings, is I would say, if there's a question that keeps you up at night, let's answer the question, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So if thousands of banks fail and we go into a Great Depression, what would you do? And one client said, well, it would be helpful if I had a cabin somewhere that had a source of, fuel for heat, so wood, and I could go hunting to eat, and I could fish, and I'd have a source of water, and I would go there with my food storage, and that's what I would do. And I said, okay, if thousands of banks fail and it all crumbles, that's what you're going to do. Now you don't have to worry about it anymore because we've already answered the question. So in a similar standpoint, in this discussion, in our session, I asked, what are you going to do if your family thinks that you're the evil apostate and a disappointment? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
So let's answer the question.
Yeah.
And you might say, well, I won't come out when I'm deep in grief, and I'm going to find shared spiritual languages, and I'm going to invite them into things, so that I can have a sense of connection. And in spite of all of that, they might think that you're the evil apostate. So what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And then if you can answer that question, you can process it with other people in a group and so forth, then it doesn't need to keep you up at night anymore because we've already answered the question.
Yeah. And what I usually tell people is, and this is during my mental health portion of the retreats and workshops that I do, one of the fastest routes to mental health is acceptance. And this is fundamental core Buddhism 101. Life is suffering. Acceptance is your best shot at recovering from the suffering of life. And so I just tell people, you may always be a disappointment to your parents. And instead of trying to shake their faith so that they'll then be able to validate the path you're taking, instead of trying to change their mind about you, what if you were to practice just accepting that you may always be a disappointment to your dad or your mom? And that's just the reality. That will be sad. You'll have to grieve it. You may be heartbreaking for you. It may be a strike to your ego and your attachment to being the good one, but it may be a faster track to ultimate healing and health. Because once you've accepted that, like you say, this kind of worst case scenario, you've accepted it, then you can grieve it and then move on and build this big, beautiful life. And you may always be a little bit sad that you're a disappointment, but by accepting it, that gives you the freedom to go build something better versus always to be resisting and fighting what's unchangeable and what's just going to cause you more suffering as you try and fight it.
Yeah, actually, this makes me want to share something from last night's meetup with John Ogden for his third Sunday meetup at Third Space Studios in Provo, for anyone that lives in Utah County. We had a discussion about our ancestral stories. And what was born out of the discussion is that if we go back in time, all of us have an ancestor that wasn't a Mormon, that left their faith and was a cause of pain and disappointment to their family. So when my parents joined the church, all my ancestors were Mennonite. It was a significant sense of pain and disappointment for my Mennonite family that my parents joined the church. But there's some beauty that came out of those stories. And so I think, what I would draw from that is that we may be a disappointment, but we weren't the first ones, and we won't be the last ones. And part of the healing process can be to talk about our ancestral stories, maybe even with the people for whom we are a disappointment.
Yeah.
and to say, you know what, our great-great-grandfather or whatever, wherever that was,
left Sweden.
when they joined Mormonism, they were a huge disappointment to their family.
And they were seeking truth.
And they were seeking truth, and they made a choice. For better or worse, it seemed to have been helpful for them for a long time. But they were a disappointment, you know. So I'm not doing this to carry on the family tradition, but this is part of what life is. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's helpful to even have those kinds of conversations directly with people.
Yeah, definitely.
So, there are other things on this slide that we've kind of already talked about. So I'll go to the next slide. The last question or comment was when people are new to the grieving process.
Wait, can I just touch on a couple things on that slide? Because I actually really like that slide.
Yeah, let's go back.
So, so you're... let's touch on them really briefly.
Okay, I'll read them.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one was, you know, when there's a question that keeps you up at night, let's answer the question, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. The next
That's kind of your worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario, yeah. The next one is understand that our identity is not our role, or in parentheses, our form or our story, or the roles that others impute upon us. That's not our identity. Our identity is our being, capital B. And things like Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth plus Oprah's Super Soul Conversation chapter reviews on her podcast, one at a time with each chapter in the book. So gold, that one.
And I learned this from Noah, that labels are chains. Roles and labels and stories are chains. They can be lead chains if they're bad labels or stories. Yeah. And they could be gold chains if they're good labels or stories, but they're still chains. Yeah. So learning to detach from labels, roles, stories is all freeing, even though at the time it feels like some type of death.
And that doesn't mean that we don't go to work or we don't thrive within our roles. It's just that we don't attach our sense of identity to our roles.
Right.
Yeah. So the next one is we are not responsible for others' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, but we can have compassion for their experiences and be thoughtful in how we express ourselves to them. So if we have loved ones that experience a tremendous amount of pain or difficulty due to our changed belief, we're actually not that's their journey. We're not responsible for that, but certainly we can be compassionate with regard to what their concerns are. So I shared in my story last week that I put a lot of thought in my letter to my mother and posted it on my blog, and some people found that helpful, unpackingambiguity.com. And one of the reasons is in that letter, I tried to express and address what my mother's primary concerns might be about what's going to happen to his marriage. Is he going to go off the deep end? Does he still seek divinity in his life? Is he going to support his wife and his daughter in their activity in the church? Those kinds of concerns. And so we can address people with compassion, but recognize that we're not responsible for their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Right.
The next one is to proactively engage them. Many don't know what to do with us, and they often withdraw. So I shared in my Mormon story last week that I actually, in addition to those who were assigned to me, I had about a half dozen of my friends reach out to me and support me and figure out how I was doing. And that was still painful because I had hundreds that didn't. And there are people in our Mormon Spectrum group that had no one reach out to them. And I think it's helpful to recognize that many just don't know what to do with us, or since we're not there, they don't see us anymore, and they're so occupied that they forget about us.
Or they're terrified.
I don't want
you're going to spread the virus.
Yeah, if I get down in the hole. Yeah, if Anthony isn't, a simpleton and he can't reconcile this particular thing, like if I sit down with him and talk to him about that stuff, what if I experience the same thing as he does about this? And that's
better stay away.
Yeah. And so again, this is not easy to do when we're in the grieving process, but growing through and post-grief is to actually reach out and positively engage with them in ways that are helpful and let them know that it's safe. We can have a safe shared experience together without talking about polygamy or Jewish origin myths,
And what I constantly try and tell people is, if you want to have a good relationship with believing family and friends and ward members, reassure them that they're safe. Make them feel safe. Tell them, I will never do anything to challenge your faith. I'll never bring up challenging problems. I'll never bring up historical tidbits or, you can be safe with me. And if you make them feel safe, then they feel disarmed, and then they feel like they want to engage with you. And you have to honor that trust as well. But you have a better shot at maintaining any of those friendships or relationships if you proactively go out of your way to say, literally, I don't ever want to talk about the church with you. Even if you come and ask me about it, I'll probably just point you to other materials, because I don't ever want to be accused of, or in reality, guilty of destroying your faith. I want you to have your own faith journey. I want to model the unconditional love that I seek. And so I'm going to totally respect your worldview, because I don't want you to agree with my worldview, but I want to at least not have you try and change my worldview or treat me like I'm broken because of my worldview. And so I'm going to model the unconditional love that I'm seeking, and you can feel safe with me. And oftentimes that's just what people want to know. It's like, oh, you won't try and convert my kids. You won't try and deconvert my spouse who, in their view has a porn problem or whatever it is. Okay, we can have a friendship again or a relationship.
Right. And you don't have to do this. Like, if it's not helpful for you to rekindle past relationships, don't feel an obligation to do that. But if there are relationships that you want to keep and nourish, like, this is the model to do that. Again, this is on the back end of processing grief.
Right. Once you're safe and stable.
Yeah. Right. And then the next thing I shared a little bit before, but understanding how grief affects our countenances, so that when we are grieving, our countenance does change because we're grieving, and recognize that other people might perceive that as Satan or something like that. But sometimes it's actually helpful to point that out to people. And so in my Mormon story, I shared an example of a friend who didn't see me a lot during my faith crisis. He saw me before my faith crisis, and then he saw me about a year or so later. And he said, there's light in you. I don't understand this. I see so many people go through faith crisis and their countenance changed. And it was helpful to have a conversation with him to express that what you're observing in these other people is that they're processing grief. And the reason that you see light in me is because I'm no longer processing grief anymore. And that was helpful for him too. And then the final one on that slide is to recognize that their responses and perceptions are not going to be static, nor are ours. And so we might have a loved one, a family member, a friend that has a very negative response to our change of belief, but recognize that's not going to be static. That's going to change over time. To not hold them to their initial reaction, and to recognize that our experiences and reconciliations aren't going to be static either. How I view these kinds of things will change over time as well. So next slide. So the next slide, actually the last slide before the last meme, is the quote, "It will get better with time." I remember early on in my faith crisis, people told me, slow down. It's going to get better with time. You've got this. And there was a period of time that I actually kind of thought that was unhelpful because it kind of felt invalidating, although it still was helpful. And to recognize that if you're supporting people that are in the grieving process, that they might have that experience too. So if you're saying affirming things, and I think it is helpful to say, you've got this, you have all the resources, even though it feels like you're sinking in quicksand, you're standing on dry ground. To recognize, and that I'll read the next bullet point, that sometimes a better response is to simply sit with people, validate their experiences, ask them about their experiences, and unconditionally love them as they grieve. And if it's appropriate to say, you've got this, it'll get better with time, do that. But don't have that be your sole response, because it can be very invalidating for people. It can feel like, and that's the last bullet point, it can feel like minimizing the pain and grief that others are experiencing sometimes. So as we support people, we need to be careful and get better at supporting people. And then the final slide for the session was a quote by Anne Voskamp. And I'll read it. The quote is, "No amount of regret changes the past. No amount of anxiety changes the future. and any amount of gratitude changes the present.
That's good.
Very good. So we need to not hold ourselves hostage to our past. We need to recognize that regret about the past isn't going to change the past. It's not going to help us in the future. No amount of anxiety about the future or trying to figure things out or what's my meaning and purpose in life now that everything's crumbled. No amount of anxiety about the future is going to change it. All we can do is live in the present and actively seek to connect with others and have gratitude in our lives. And those are the things that are going to change. We can only change the present. We can't change the past. And anxiety is not going to change the future. So that was my session.
I love it. We've had a lot of listeners tuning in live. We want to thank everyone who's joined us over these 3 hours or so. Kathy writes, beautiful. Deb writes, using the term grief seems to be so disarming for everyone. So she's liking that idea of talking about grief because it's something everyone can kind of relate to on some level, hopefully, if they're open. Anne is reflecting this idea that it's important to respect each other's differences. Anne says, this is good advice. Kimberly Anderson, shout out to Kimberly. Kimberly writes, I went back to that Mormon divergent point in my family tree and took that last name. It was heavily symbolic. That's powerful.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Kimberly, we love you. And we've had Kimberly on Mormon Stories in the past. She has talked to us about the sort of experience of being a transgender person within Mormonism, and she's been fabulous to remind me to not forget to speak up, not just for our LGB members, but also to not forget the trans experience. So I'm going to just explicitly mention that because I love Kimberly and I love our trans and gender non-binary members of our community.
Right. So Kimberly Anderson is a jewel, and she listened to my interview and posted on my timeline and told people it's worth watching.
Yeah.
And
she's a sweetheart.
And I'm interested in visiting with her about it a little bit, but I came from such a sense of privilege and didn't experience even remotely anything like the trauma that she might have experienced. But it meant a lot to me that she would connect to my experience and support my experience. And so I want to go back and listen to your interview with her to understand her experience too.
Yeah, she's great. Same with Lori. I'm spacing.
Yes, the stake president.
Yeah, she's great. All right. Well, this has been amazing. We've had so many amazing listeners. Also, Sarah Hughes Zabawa posted a link to her blog. She's going to be working on a PDF of those spiritual values.
Perfect.
So we'll get that out to people as soon as we can. But shout out to Sarah for her good work as well. And just a huge thanks to you, Anthony, for sharing your wisdom and perspective. Sean Escobar he writes, I've been out 15 months now. Things shift towards building back up what was lost. It's beautiful. Anthony has been a great resource. So love you, Sean, and your wife, Crystal. The Mormon Enlightenment is a real phenomenon these days on Facebook, an incredible community of fun younger folk, from my perspective, younger folk, all celebrating and healing and growing. So a shout out to the Escobars and their amazing work. And another vote of affection from them to you, Anthony.
I love the Escobars.
For your great work.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thanks for everyone tuning in. And most importantly, Anthony, thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. Any final words or resources or links you want to share with everybody?
I'll just continue to post things on my blog. I'll share these episodes as well. And you'll still find me presenting at Sunstone or at Thrive conferences and things like that. So this is part of what feeds me now, and I'm very, very grateful to be here and participate today. Thank you very much.
And are we in a recession or are we not in a recession?
It depends on what gets tweeted in the morning. Yeah, we are in a government, in a global slowdown.
So sell? Bit. Are you saying sell?
No, I'm not saying sell. I'm saying have a plan on the front end so that you can weather a storm and not have to try to time the market. Yeah.
All right. Well, we love you, and we are grateful for you, Anthony. Come back often to Mormon Stories Podcast. Keep up the great work.
Yeah, will do.
And thanks again. So thanks to everyone who joins us. Thanks to everyone who makes all this possible. For those who donate to the Open Stories Foundation or Mormon Stories, thank you. We literally couldn't do this without you. Huge thanks to Cody Layton for his podcast production. Cody, you're amazing. And if you don't support the Open Stories Foundation or Mormon Stories, we invite you to become a monthly donor or subscriber by going to mormonstories.org and clicking on the donate button. 10, 15, 20, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. We're financially transparent. We're here to help you. All the money goes towards this mission of providing resources, support, community, healing, and growth for people experiencing a faith transition. Check out the Thrive Conference at thrivebeyondmormonism.com. Sign up November 17th for Wayne sermon of Imagine Dragons, of Amber Scorah, Jehovah's Witness, Natasha, Christian. So many amazing people. I think John Hamer's going to be there. Spencer Nugent, Donna Showalter. Who else? The Encircle, Stephenie Larsen. So many cool speakers. Check out the Thrive Conference. We want to get 3,900 people there, max out the facility. We've priced it at $15 a person. You're going to get a full day of awesomeness for $15. So please join us at the Thrive Beyond Mormonism Conference. And stay tuned for more cool stuff in the weeks and months ahead. Love you guys. Thanks again, Anthony. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. And we'll see you guys all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.